Really looking forward to today's webinar. So I'm going to jump really quickly to my introduction, then we'll come back to the I guess different kind of agenda and the items that we have for us today. The reason why I'm going to do that is so kind of my introduction. We've been doing this now for about 12 years. My name is Kyle. I'm the CEO technically here at Reviewer. And I'm very fortunate in the sense that I've been able to work with thousands of organizations doing not just scholarship programs, but also member recognition awards, grants, fellowships, call for speakers. And quite frankly, the use case of our platform doesn't differ that much between those different kind of use cases. So I totally understand that there's different submission processes and different evaluation processes and workflows in between. But there's really three kind of core common consistencies between all these different types of campaigns. There's some type of submission experience, there is an operational management kind of program team experience, and there's some type of review selection kind of final awarding experience. And so again, I've been fortunate now to work with thousands of organizations of big and small and different industries using our platform in very different unique ways. And obviously that's not only what's helped develop our platform, so it's kind of a built for the people by the people type of tool, but also we're able to really kind of hear what's going on. So our ears are on the ground and we're hearing different trends and different kind of ways of running these programs that continuously pop up. And so we actually will make it a very deep part of our implementation and setup process to better understand kind of what people are up to, how they want to run their programs, where they think they're going to be 3 to 5 years from now. And that's kind of really what helps kind of influence not just the utilization of the platform, but also helping us find you different types of resources that can overall better the space. And I think that's a really good kind of introduction to why we're here today. So, I already kind of mentioned we started the company about 12 different years ago. And we did so from our own kind of firsthand volunteer experience. So our team was the ones who were being sent these really comprehensive binders and physical pieces of paper in the mail because back then tools like us didn't exist. And so we are part of the review and selection teams. And so we were handwriting notes and feedback and filling out score sheets. And, we'd meet for 8 hours on a Saturday with other committee members. We'd be doing phone calls. We'd be mailing things back in. And to say it was overwhelming from a review team perspective is a complete understatement. The challenge for us, however, especially with these scholarship programs, is two things. Number one, there wasn't infinite money, right? Unfortunately, there's not enough money to go around to everyone. And so there are highly competitive application workflows. And being that we were working with primarily mission driven organizations, those individuals that are going to receive funding were typically well on their way to success, right? Obviously, the funding was a big part of it. But if you had 100 applicants to make up a number, how do you provide value to all 100 people, not just those that receive funding? And so we really were trying to offer insights and feedback into why we were choosing people the way that we did in hopes that that feedback would work its way back to the applicants for some type of self-development, some type of self-growth. That way they could achieve funding elsewhere. As you can imagine, being that this was done through paper and binders, that really wasn't happening. Now, fast forward in 2024, the transparency and the self-development actually is now one of the emerging trends that we're starting to see. So we are 12 years early on that. The reason why we really exist, though, is probably that 2014 timeframe. And many of you guys may be experiencing this now or saw this in the past, where two really unfortunate things started to happen. This is the reason why we exist. Number one is that we saw very obvious review committee members making biased and unfair selections of candidates based off of demographic details, personal biases of who they knew. They were maybe golfing buddies with that candidate's parent. And so we saw that happening. On the other side of things, because of a lack of technology and tools, most scholarships are being ran through a wide variety of, I guess we'll call them platforms and tools. So emails, spreadsheets, downloading of documents, Google Drive, their databases. And being that none of those tools were intended for the task at hand, two things happened. Number one, we spent significantly more time because now we're hopping around like 8 different platforms. But the bigger concern was that there was one use case where a bunch of high school seniors were applying to a scholarship fund, and a handful of them went to a spam filter. So this organization sat down, they cut checks, they awarded funding, and then months and months later, they found out that there were a handful of kids that didn't get included in the selection. So as you can all imagine, obviously it's very unfortunate. It's a bad look on everybody that was involved. It's becoming a compliance issue, and quite frankly, that was the precedent that set Reviewer on this warpath to basically commit to the community to never let that happen again. by providing all the tools and infrastructure in place, not just to run the programs, but then kind of come full circle during our setup processes. Really try to dive deep into like the different ways that you want to use the platform slash run your programs, and not only configure the system to meet those needs, but also kind of dig into our big portfolio of other organizations that we work with to figure out like are there other trends and use cases that might permeate into your programs that overall make them a bit more successful. So as you can imagine now, over 12 years, I hear so many different ways of running a scholarship program. And at this point in time here in mid 2024, it's hard to believe we're already approaching July. There are kind of 8 core trends that we're really starting to see pop up within the space. So that kind of brings us back then to today's agenda. So I kind of gave you my quick introduction. I'm not going to get too much more deep into that. My goal today really isn't to dive into reviewer, although we will absolutely take a peek at it, just to kind of help visualize some of these 8 trends that we're starting to see. If anybody wants to chat more about the platform or how it might work for you, please do let me know. But that'd be for a future conversation. So the 8 kind of trends that we want to cover today before I get into it is number one is a pretty fundamental shift with how we're collecting things like references. Now, the process of collecting a reference can also permeate into things like transcripts or parent letters, lots of other use cases, but really we're going to focus on the reference concept and why letters may be an outdated approach and why we might want to shift more towards a template approach. Number two, and this is a very big topic today, is AI content detection. We actually hosted a webinar probably 2 months ago. It's on our website, and this is also maybe for a follow-up conversation, because this can be a really, another hour-long deep conversation. But how can we start to identify the utilization of scholarship applicants using tools like ChatGPT, not necessarily in a bad way, but make it more visible to you and your staffs? Number three really comes back down to the roots of why we exist at Reviewers. How do we kind of create this ecosystem and process around creating a fair, non-biased, compliant framework of taking your scholarship applicants, divvying it out to a review team to conduct their selections. We'll get into like maybe rethinking how we're doing score sheets. So maybe getting away from like your traditional 1 through 5s, 1 through 10s, things like that, and shifting more towards like a question prompt based scoring model that is more of a reflection on like the mission and vision of your organization. And then kind of running through the last couple quickly, the normalizing of results. I'm going to come back to that a bit more here in a second, but how do we start to identify potential evaluators on your team who are a bit more strict than others or lenient than others and take that into consideration? And then the last, so we really do kind of go hand in hand, is how do we actually measure impact? We're going to sit down at the end of the year, we're going to get together with our boards and our stakeholders, and how do we kind of put our stamp of approval on these campaigns and say, yes, it was absolutely a success, and we set out and we solved the challenges that we intended to. And a lot of that does come back with, things like proof of processes, transparency, and then of course a commonly brought up thing, but often overlooked, which is kind of data security and privacy. Those on the call, who are deep into like the kind of data security side of things, what type of compliances should you be looking for? What's like the industry gold standards? At the end of the day, these are mission critical types of programs or changing people's lives, and they have to be thought of as such. So with all that said, let's jump into our first topic today, which is going to be reference collection. What I'm going to do here in just a moment is I'm going to switch over to Reviewer just to walk you through what a common kind of reference collection model might look like. Before I do that, though, just to kind of set the stage just a little bit on the concept behind it. So, traditionally speaking, with all scholarships, if you're collecting references, many times the applicants will procrastinate, and that's in general, right? They're always going to wait to the very last minute. That typically also means that the person writing the reference for them is going to be asked at the very last minute. So they're already working, I guess, against the 8 ball. They're behind the gun, and so they're going to be rushing through this and maybe not putting forth the effort that the applicants desire. But if anybody on this call today has ever written a reference, like quite frankly, it's a bit challenging because you're asked at the last minute to sit down from scratch and write a full-blown letter. Now, many times references might have like a template that they always work off of. They're just kind of changing out names. But now we lose the purpose of the reference, right? Where's the personal kind of storytelling and the impact that comes with it? They're also a barrier for the references because for many of you, they may be having to write these offline. They're kind of off in their own world doing things. You have got no idea like what the progress is of them. Not even the applicants know if their references have been submitted or not. And then they're going to submit it to you through email and attachments, and you got to figure out like who does this reference belong to. You got to merge them together. We're going to get more into like the compliance things later on, but like then how do you redact the information? So all these challenges come into play. So the trend shift that we're starting to see, and this is becoming a really core component to a reviewer, is avoiding reference letters. So number one is we want the references to be submitted directly from the source themselves. I've never seen a negative written reference, but with that said, they are still typically a very private process. So the goal here is to actually have the references submit to you directly their reference, but then instead of doing our reference letter, why don't we do a one or two things or a combination of both? And that's called a reference template. So what are the 3 to 5 things that you want the references to talk about? And then instead of filling out a letter, they just answer those 3 to 5 things. You also may be able to map that back to like a scorecard concept where, answer these 3 questions about the candidate, but then also on a scale of 1 to 5, rank them on these kind of 4 characteristics, right? That make up the ideal scholarship applicant to your organization. So that way, when you go to sit down to do an actual review, judging, selection process, the data is now very consistent amongst all of your candidates. You're actually comparing apples to apples. You're not going to have that one reference writer who's just significantly better writer than another person, which is more of a reflection on them as the writer than the applicant themselves. It also will significantly lower the barrier for your references, hopefully ensuring that they get into the system or whatever tool that you're using very early on, and you're not having to do a bunch of follow-ups, or even worse, having an applicant get disqualified for not having the deliverables because it really wasn't even on them to begin with, it was on the reference. So there's a lot of benefits behind kind of transitioning to this model. But now I hear what you're thinking is 2 things. One is how do we actually do that? And then two, if we have these references being submitted directly from the source, how on earth are you going to track that? Because you have to know how many outstanding references were requested, what their progress was, and have some type of reminder system in place, both from you as an organization, but then also from an applicant's perspective to ensure that they come through. So with all that said, let's actually look at what an ideal reference process would look like in a platform like Reviewer. So I'm going to really start at a high level with the submission process because that's really where it all happens. So at least in a platform like us, the applicants create their accounts, they come into the tool, and they fill out their scholarship application. Just to kind of tease it a little bit, your applications typically consist of 3 to 4 key components. Who are you? Tell us more about your academics. The other 2 pieces I'm going to talk about are kind of a foreshadowing and a teaser to the review process later on. At this point in time, everybody gets 4.0s. Everybody gets 4.3 out nowadays. So how do you start to allow the applicants to kind of differentiate themselves from other candidates? So as I kind of scroll through here, we'll avoid the reference for now. We'll come back to that. So you want to ask things like GPA, information about them. You get into things like file uploads or transcripts. And then they'll start to ask them more things about like their personal achievements. Let's talk more about like their volunteer and their community impact, right? Things that are outside of the classroom or outside of the academic world. Now, I totally understand that many scholarships are need-based and analysis-based. That's totally fine. But let's also kind of try to incorporate some of these other components to your forms. I mentioned AI content detection here a little bit earlier on. That's the next piece that we're going to talk about. But as you can see here, that's really the core differentiator between your candidates is their storytelling and their personal impact statements and their essays. So let's empower them to be able to save, log out, come back later, and actually put thoughtful content on paper. The goal of your entire submission process has to be to empower applicants to write the best application as humanly possible, set them up for success by lowering any potential barriers. I don't want to see people having to do fillable PDFs. I don't want them to be using other tools that they have to export, download, and send back to you guys. It has to be kind of comprehensive into one centralized hub. Things like file uploads and components, videos, FAFSA, whatever it might be, the ability to collect them in one place, e-signatures. But really what I want to talk about here is that reference. So let's go back to that. So in a perfect environment, what's going to end up happening is in your submission process, you want to ask very early on who the references are. So the applicant's going to put in the first name, the last name, and the email of whoever's writing the reference. The reason why we want to ask this early on is it's actually going to trigger a notification to go to that reference. And so if we ask early on, we know that notification goes out very early on in the process. This allows ample time for the reference to get their work done, but also allows the applicants to proceed on with the rest of their scholarship application and not get bogged down or hung up on another component that they're not quite ready for yet. Again, even though they can say they can log out, they can come back later, if we have multiple people contributing to their profile, let's get it in their hands early. So in this use case, we got people like Dwight here. Dwight's going to get some type of email notification that's going to say, hey, Dwight, you've been asked to write a reference on behalf of Michael for this year's scholarship program. Here's some of the characteristics that we're looking for. Here's some more background on us. Click here to actually submit your reference. Now, this is where things completely change. So in this use case, Dwight, the reference writer, clicks on the link within that email, and it brings Dwight directly to what I call that reference template. Now, again, I would love to see this broken into two pieces. This one only has one of those elements where, it's going to tell them exactly who it's for, who are you, and then let's do three things or two things. One, it's like, what are the three kind of essay prompts you want the reference to talk about? Again, lower the barrier. There's reading the question and they're typing in their answer. And then two is if you do want to leverage some type of a score sheet that aligns with both the application form or your own personal score sheets for the applicant, what's their leadership capability, what's their community impact, right? All these things that you might be looking for, have them fill out a very simple like 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 scale. This example might be a bit overkill, but at the end of the day, whenever we go to review these applicants, every single applicant has the same data associated with them. In fact, using a tool like Reviewer, we can actually tabulate some of these reference results and then automatically add it to like your review and judging team scorecards. So that way it merges all of them for a final selection. Again, no right or wrong way of doing that, but there's some cool things that we can do. Now, with that said, if you do still want to offer letters, by all means, go ahead. You can make it optional, so that way it's just more so to have on file. It's up to you, but you have to be able to make sure that you can collect all of that in one spot. So reference comes in, they fill this out. What happens next? So from an operation perspective, on your dashboards, we're not going to get deep into this today. It's actually going to show you visibility on like how many outstanding references we have, and then you can start to really dive into who they are, how far have they made it, their progress percentages. Leverage automation to send them auto email reminders. So dear Dwight, we see that you've been requested to write a reference on behalf of Michael. It's due in 3 days, right? And so automatically have that happen on a trigger. But then from Michael's perspective, he can come back in or she can come back into Reviewer, see outstanding references. They can't see the actual content of it, but they can see if it's been done or not. That way they can also have some type of self-ownership and do their own follow-ups for accountability. So great, we've got these notifications that went out, the reference filled it out. You guys have an idea of what's happening, how many are outstanding, where they're at. How do you physically look at those references? So whenever you come into the system, you're actually going to see a list of those references that came in. So in this use case, I've got two of them, one from Dwight, one from Toby. If I then come over to the side and press on the view button, I can actually open the reference up and it'll embed it right in our system. So you never have to actually download or export or leave the system. You can view all of it in one centralized hub. So again, in my opinion, kind of a total game changer of how references are being collected. But more holistically speaking, even without a tool like Reviewer, I think we have to shift away from letters and move more towards this template-based process. Again, the chat's open, so any insights or comments or thoughts, if you guys are already doing this, that's great. Let me know. I'd love to hear that. Toss it in the chat. All right, so, oh yeah, one last thing too to show you. If you are still doing reference files, one thing we have to avoid, since we are living in a very mobile environment nowadays, is that you have to be able to physically view the reference right in the system like Reviewer, not download those PDFs or those Word documents and find other tools to access it and then come back into our tool. So moving back into our presentation, the next thing that we're going to look at today is AI content detection. Now, again, we had a whole full-blown webinar on this, so I'm going to touch high level on it today. If you want to go check that out, by all means, you can. But at a high level, we're basically looking at here is back in November of 23, a study was done, and I think that this is now very outdated, that at that point in time, over 60% of scholarship applications leverage the assistance of tools like ChatGPT to help write their essay content. Now, many of you have essay prompts that are very personal storytelling. So you might be wondering, well, how are they using AI if it's a personal essay? I think we'd be very shocked, or maybe you're not shocked, of how good, especially now with Chat GPT 4.0 or 4.0, really is. And so, applicants are actually copying and pasting essay prompts out of your scholarship forms, putting it into those tools, and copying and pasting it back in. Now, ideally, I think, again, tools like ChatGPT and AI utilization are not going away. In fact, I think they should be promoted, and they are being promoted both in the workforce as well as in school. It's a tool to make our lives more efficient and easier. And so, if that is the case, we would expect applicants to use them. How do we expect them to use it? More so, would be helping them build a framework around an essay. So, hey, here's an essay prompt. Like, what are the six kind of key areas that I should talk about? And then from there, the applicants can jump in and actually write their own essay, right? So it's helping build like an agenda for their essay. Again, I think that's okay. What's not okay is direct copying and pasting out of those tools into your scholarship forms. We also need to kind of take into consideration that we'll get into our tools here in a sec. If we're going to be running detection and looking into if it was utilized or not, we have to know where to look. So that means a lot of times we need to move essays and content out of file uploads and more so into like the submission tool that you're utilizing. Bigger picture, if you're also redacting data, it's significantly easier to redact open-ended text in a form versus having to download, export, redact stuff and put it back in. So the things that I think you need to think about and why this is helpful is, what is the threshold? Like, you're not going to have people not use AI. That's understandable. So like, what's the acceptable amount? And then where can I as a company come in to help you out? And that's kind of where we'll get into next, which is a tool that we're calling Sidekick. It will be launching here hopefully in the next month to 2 months. We're deep into development. But the goal behind it is to not make decisions for you at all. The goal is to help bring awareness to what's happening so you can make data-driven decisions. What I also will tell you is, over the next 6 to 8 months, this is going to dramatically change as those tools are adapting and growing, as we're identifying additional trends. And my commitment and promise to you is that we will stay at the forefront of providing value. So the way that we envision this working is, you're going to have some type of menu system, which you already have in a reviewer, that shows you a listing of all of your applicants or your candidates. The next thing that we want to do is run kind of two different detections. One is going to read all of the desired essay prompts. So you may not want to run it for everybody. You may save this just for your finalists. Again, there's so many ways to incorporate this, but we're going to run two different types of detections. One is, hey, on these essay questions, how much AI utilization was there? Was it 100% copy and paste, or is it 10% where they just helped write grammar and spell check, right? Because that's, even nowadays, tools like Grammarly will flag it. The other check we want to run is going to be things like plagiarism. So obviously it's not as prevalent in scholarships, but it is obviously in scientific research papers and symposiums, abstracts, speakers, things like that. So we're going to give you two different kind of columns. One will be the score for AI detection, one will be for plagiarism. And the main goal here is for you to be able to filter and sort and visualize, like, what is that threshold. So on average, I have a 27% rating. So anybody who's over 20%, specifically like the 80+% range, are ones that we may want to kind of look into a bit further. So if that is the case, what we'll do from there is we'll open up their profiles and we'll show you each of the individual questions that they filled out that we ran detection against. And you're going to see, again, two scores. One will be the AI detection, the other will be the plagiarism detection score. So the thought here is that you can actually click into the AI score and it'll show you exactly how it was detected. So it'll show you, like, if it was 100% content, if it was 15%, but then a human intervention, so that we can start to make data-informed decisions. Now, we're using multiple tools and integrations to do this. We cannot rely on just a single source, especially as additional tools like ChatGPT emerge. So you've got like your Claude, you've got all these, you've got tools from Microsoft. So we have to be able to check multiple tools, multiple sources, and then think of it like a credit score, where you're not just using your FICO score. It's incorporating like 4 different kind of scores for one comprehensive overview. And that's kind of our rationale behind that. Kind of going back to your plagiarism detection, significantly easier, right? Because it was plagiarized, that means it exists somewhere. We know where that is. So we kind of dive deeper into that score. we're able to not only identify if it was plagiarized or not, but how much it was. So if it was a verbatim word for word identical match, if it was paraphrased, if they made some small tweaks to it, we can actually physically show you both what we caught, but then also where it was found. So again, databases are out there. We can actually see if it was pulled from a website, if it was pulled from somebody else's LinkedIn article. So many cool things are happening. Again, to reiterate, by no means are we here to make decisions for you. We just want to make you aware of what's happening with your applicants so you can make your own kind of decisions. The next phase to this is helping share best practices, right? So we're going to start to really identify like what is the average utilization, right? That way you can start to kind of create your own barometers and thresholds around that as well. We can start to think through like what type of automation do you want to have. So if you start to catch people who are at 80%, like what happens next? Low hanging fruit, toss in some type of checkbox in your form. So if I go back to our example here, if I go to like the last page of my submission form, where you have your e-signature, maybe have a couple check boxes here that says, yeah, I am who I say I am. Yeah, this is all accurate. And yes, I did not use AI, right? That in itself is going to defer a lot of people away from using it. But if they are going to use it, we're here to help. Next topic today, again, this is probably my favorite thing to talk about, not in an exciting way because it's quite sad some of the things that we've seen happen, but also it's why we exist, right? And so our commitment is that we want to allow applicants to have faith in your program, that when they go to apply, they know that they got the fair opportunity that they deserved and that they were not selected, they put up a good fight and it was out of the fairness of it. And so with that said, what are the two main components? Again, there's a lot that can go into these review processes and workflows, but what are the two main components? So number one is we have to create an ecosystem for an impartial review. Many of you may be offering multiple scholarships. You might have different funders. You might have multiple phases of review and selection processes. You might have different committees. That's okay. We don't want to change anything, right? So in a typical environment for our reviewer clients is that they segment out their scholarship applicants into bite-sized pieces. Again, it could be phases of review. It could be categories, scholarships, whatever it might be. And that's totally fine. I don't want to change anything. The piece that I do want to maybe look into is once you have kind of what I call a bucket full of submissions and potential evaluators, how do you decide who's going to be reviewing who? And so for this is awful, but we have a client of ours that before working with us had over 900 scholarship essays, and they had a four-person committee that read every single one of those 900. There's no physical way that you can give the 900th applicant the same energy that you gave the first, and you're starting to get very cloudy of like, what was number three versus 800 again? And so we want to make sure we're doing a couple of things here. Is I want you to be able to take your applicants, somehow randomly distribute it out to the review committee, but then also be very aware of like the workload capacities of your selection team, as well as like how many reviews does each candidate need to get kind of a very accurate representation on the quality of their work. So if you're not currently surveying your review committees and kind of getting a better feel for like how long does it take you to review one, how many hours do you feel like you can put forth to this? You need to be doing that because you'll work backwards from those results to influence how many submissions each one will get and then how you distribute them out. The second piece to this is the redaction of data. So we magically figured out a way to give our review team submissions to review. The next thing is that we don't want them to be able to physically see demographic details, who they are. Ultimately, if you think it's personal identifying information, it probably is. Always err on the side of caution. Student information is virtually anything nowadays, right? So if it's not pertinent to the review and selection process, and what I mean by that is when your review team sits down, they look at somebody's submission, they fill out a score sheet. If the content that they're evaluating doesn't directly tie to the score sheet, just don't show it to them. It may not even be PII. It might just be, overwhelming your review committee with a bunch of stuff that's more so for record keeping purposes. Now, before I look at this in Reviewer, and again, this is a powerful tool we have, is if you're going to go this route, it does open a humongous challenge for you. This typically implies that not every applicant is being reviewed by the same reviewers. And if that's the case, I'm a huge fan of Shark Tank on ABC. If you remember Mr. Wonderful, he was always the quote unquote hard ass, right? And then you got Barbara, who's always the nice one. And so if that's the case, you got that going on. You cannot penalize applicants who were scored by Robert that weren't scored by Barbara. So I'm going to kind of tease that. We'll come back to that here in just a little bit. So how do you create these review workflows in Reviewer that encompass those two components? The one thing I do want to add before we go there, because I'm going to show this to you guys all together, is kind of broadening our evaluation criterias. Traditionally speaking, we give judges these score sheets, and the score sheets are going to be like a 1 through 5, a 1 through 10. You might weight them, that's totally fine. The challenge that we're starting to see, though, is oftentimes evaluators and humans in general get really kind of overwhelmed and bogged down in fine details. So if you got like a 1 through 20 scale or a 1 through 30 scale, that's a bit on the larger end of the spectrum. And you're going to have people questioning, like, well, what's the difference between a 24 and a 26, right? And it doesn't seem like a huge difference, but when you start to take into consideration averages, it really does impact the scores. We also want to kind of take a look at, like, when you go to do a selection of a candidate, let's start to kind of take away some of the more academic elements to it. I totally understand grades, all that kind of stuff is a huge driver in scholarships, and I'm not trying to change anything there. But at this point in time, when you've got a bunch of people who are all getting really good grades, it's not always a really good story about why they're deserving. So that's where I want to get it deeper into, like, your volunteer hours, how they're impacting their communities. Tell me more about their personal storytelling, their needs. Let them differentiate themselves from other candidates, and your score sheets have to align with that. So if you are taking into consideration things like your GPA or your volunteer hours, don't even have your review team score that. Technically speaking, in a tool like Reviewer, we know what their GPA is. And so if you want to give a certain point value for certain kind of brackets, 3.0 to 3.25, 3.25 onwards, whatever it might be, we can actually read the submission form, allocate a point value, and then merge it with overall selections. That way your review team isn't trying to read through that stuff and then auto assign their own points and kind of get bogged down in the math. So I'm going to come back to this. The solution, though, to this is, instead of doing like a 1 through 5 or a 1 through 10, is treat it more like a reference template where you ask the review committees more of like an emotional statement of, like, how do you feel about this topic? How do you feel about their academic achievements? How do you feel about their essay writing? And from good to great, or thumbs up, thumbs down, start to incorporate more of like an emotional response. And then don't worry, behind the scenes, there still will be some type of point value. That way you can justify the results. They just, as they're filling it out, aren't in charge of, allocating points themselves. So all that said, what do these kind of 2 to 3 components look like in a tool like Reviewer? So if I jump back over here, we have a concept called bucketing, and it's our workflow management system. And again, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of Reviewer today, but it is arguably one of the most impactful features that we have to save your team a significant amount of time and energy. But the goal here is that you create these review workflows based off of your desired processes. It could be a combination of the multiple scholarships you offer with the multiple phases of review. It could be, fall versus spring. Like, there's an infinite number of ways to configure this. But at its core, we're basically taking a bunch of your scholarship applicants and we're going to drop them into a bucket that they belong to. Again, what bucket they belong to, we can kind of get into in a different discussion. Ideally, we are leveraging some type of automation. So for example, if I'm applying to the Lennox Wilder scholarship, the system knows, hey, Kyle belongs to that scholarship, so therefore let's drop them into that bucket. The next step is to take your bucket. So again, let's jump down to the Lennox Wilder one, is to fill it up with a team of evaluators. So in this use case, whenever Simon, Paula, and Mark come into Reviewer, they're only going to see the submissions in the Lennox Wilder scholarship bucket. Now, in its core, that's great. You can have your evaluators in as many buckets as you want. It's how you kind of control privacy. Maybe you want to have like a chair that's leading that team of evaluators. We can encompass all of that. But the thing I want to show you next is, once we open up our scholarship bucket, let's hypothetically say, in this example, we've got 6 submissions, just for simplicity. Maybe there was 106 and you have a 10-person review committee. Well, they're probably not going to be reviewing all 106 because that's going to take them an overwhelming amount of time. So instead, let's figure out those things I mentioned earlier on. On average, how many submissions does my evaluation team feel comfortable scoring? And then backload that. How many evaluations does each submitter have to have a fair representation? So maybe that's no less than 4, no more than 6. Maybe it's exactly 6 scores get submitted for each submission, right? Whatever those numbers look like. And in our tool, you can actually bulk select people, and then you can auto assign them. So I could take all of my evaluators and then auto assign them out to ensure that every applicant gets looked at no more than 6 times, but no less than 4, because we know that that's our parameters. On this flip side of things, I could say, well, I know our team can never review more than 20 because that's just too many for them, but they have to review at least 12 because that's how many are required to ensure that they get reviewed 5 times each, right? So there's some math that comes into this, and our system will do all the math for you. But as soon as you press go, our system will take the submissions and then auto assign them back out magically for you. The next piece to that, though, is you have to have some type of way of recusing people. So ideally, as you're adding your review team into the system, there are some kind of elements that might say, hey, this person shouldn't be reviewing this type of candidate. So we can build that in. But I like to see in your score sheet some type of question that says I have to recuse myself. And if that is the case, you can then jump in here and override stuff. So I can take Mark as a judge, and I can maybe unselect Gabrielle because Gabrielle is golfing buddies with her father, and reassign this back out to Gilligan. So we're overriding the automation, but at its core, we're taking submissions and we're randomly assigning them out. So the next piece of the puzzle is the redaction of data. So in a tool like Reviewer, we can automatically redact stuff for you, assuming we know what it is. So name, email, demographic details, all that kind of fun stuff. Where redaction of data becomes a bit more challenging is when it's open-ended text prompts. So things like essays, which the good news in Reviewer is that since we can't quite yet, and I say yet because we are working on it, identify what's PII in an essay prompt, you as a programs team can still read through things and make modifications before it gets in the hands of the evaluators. That's why we want to move it out of potentially file uploads and move it into essay prompts, because file uploads now require you to download things, manipulate the data, re-upload it back in. So just kind of a fair warning on that front. So when reviewers come into the system, they get a menu and it shows them ideally a redacted list of the candidates that they're supposed to be scoring. Once they're in the system, they simply then click on the name or ID of who they're supposed to be reviewing, and we show them a split screen. So the left-hand side of my page is the redacted information. So it's whatever information you want the review team to see. You might have 150 questions and 32 uploads. That's fine, but you want them just to review these 6 questions in this one file. So we define what shows up for evaluators. They come into the system, they only see those 6 core components. You can also see off to the right now, I have my score sheet. And this is a really good example of how I like to structure scorecards, where we lower the barrier. The evaluator is able to side by side, read through the form. They can jump up top. They can look at file uploads. I mentioned beforehand ease of access. So if it's a reference letter or if it's an image or whatever it might be, a transcript, they can press a view and it embeds itself in Reviewer. So they're never having to leave the system. And ideally, your score sheet follows along the format of your forms. And so they're answering things like, from poor to above average, or from poor to tremendous, rate their extracurriculars, rate their leadership capabilities. Tell me more about their community service. When it gets into essays, like, was the grammar right? Was the length right? Was the personal storytelling right? They're not, trying to assign 6 points here, 5 points here, 2 points here. They're just answering, yeah, this was tremendous. This was not tremendous. This was a below average. And then you will notice that at the bottom, just trying to indicate, it does do auto tabulations for you. So many of our clients don't even show the evaluation team scores anymore. They just make them fill this out. And then behind the scenes, it does the scorecards. So in our system, what ends up happening, and again, you can have them side by side review reference letters. They can click on the reference, boom, it shows up. I mentioned earlier on that if your references are having that scoring component, it can actually auto add it to the total score. So down here at the bottom where it says 29, part of that score might have been derived from the references. Again, I've seen everything at this point in time, and I kind of love that concept. But the goal here is that when you then kind of go to pull your ranking tool, it's going to show you a leaderboard, and in real time, it'll rank people from high to low on a per bucket basis. So per scholarship, per phase of review. It'll show you who your review teams were, their total scores, their averages. And for many of you, this might be the end all be all. This is how you make decisions. Some of you might leverage this for deliberation purposes. So you open this up and you guys kind of deliberate about it. But I want to kind of talk about one thing that leads into the next item, which is the normalization of results. So as you can see here, Mark, who we already looked at earlier on, scored Sheldon as a 12, but Judge Judy scored a 31. So right away, my brain kind of red flag goes off, and I say, well, did Mark just really not like Sheldon? Was it just a low scoring applicant? Or what if Mark never gives higher than a 15? And if that is the case, getting a 12 actually isn't a bad thing. It's actually a very, very good score for that individual judge. But with a traditional judging model, anybody that Mark scores low, because that's just how he scores, is going to fall lower in the list. I'm going to show you an example right now of an Ivy League university who uses a reviewer who before this actually would award funding, and they identified people who didn't get funded just because they had certain committee members that were different scores than others, right? So that was happening at an Ivy League level. So kind of what does that look like? So I call it normalization of results. But again, I've already kind of told you that story of, two different evaluators, one on average scores higher than the other. So the goal here is to be able to identify that and then take action on it. So I'm not going to get too deep into the slide because I've already kind of incorporated that example. But what we want to do is basically figure out what each individual judge's averages are and then convert individual scores to that judge's average. So what does that look like? So in Reviewer, this is a spreadsheet that we're going to kind of look at just to kind of help visualize it. But you basically get a listing of every single one of your applicants. You get each individual judge and how they score on a per question basis, because we need the raw data to figure out like, A, how do they score that particular candidate? If you weight things, then obviously that becomes very important. But what you guys really care about is this green section right in the middle. So what we've done here, and this is all happening with one click of the button in our system, is we're showing you each individual judge's averages. So Judge Judy on average scores about a 24, but Tony over here scores on average about a 34. This is the example I'm talking about. So this is, again, everything here is redacted, but this is real people, real scores from an Ivy League institution. Anybody that Tony scores always ranked higher than anybody that Judge Judy scored. So the question then came up, like, why is that? Well, it's because Judge Judy on average scores a full 10 points lower than Tony. So now that we do that, we change the scores. So instead of getting a score of a 24 from Judge Judy, now you get a 1 because 24 is exactly 1. That's average. Anybody that Judge Judy scores higher than 24 is like a 1.15. Anybody that she scores lower than a 1 is like or lower than average is like a 0.96, right? Just for example purposes. So now that we're able to identify each individual judge's averages and we compare each candidate against their average, we can then take overall averages and compare them to one another. So this is what the end result looks like. You got Bruce Banner here that scores on average amongst all of the judges 1.15 times higher than their averages. You then get Elon here, who is 0.83, almost a full 2/10 of a point lower. And so typically speaking, we have clients that will use this as their final decision-making matrix. Many others will incorporate this traditional judging and deliberation to leverage data to make those informed decisions off of. So again, there's no right or wrong way, but I do personally think it's a really cool thing. It is a problem in this space. We've got some evaluators that just score different than others. We have to be aware of what's happening. The next couple of things that we're going to look at, and I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these for ample time for Q&A, is measuring impact. So I think we all agree that at the end of the day, we have to be able to go back to our team and say this program was a success. For a scholarship program, you gave somebody funding for whatever purpose. The goal is to help change their lives. Did we do so? So the actual reporting side of things is extremely easy. I think we all agree that we have to know if we provided impact or not. So it all starts with like creating internal goals and kind of KPIs, right? So when you set out to run your scholarship, how do you want to report back to your team? Was it a success, yes or not? So once you know kind of what those KPIs are, this is where things become challenging, is you have to have the data to power that report. So obviously in Reviewer, we want to automate that for you. It'll just build it for you. So it's on you and your team to figure out the KPI reporting, right? Because that should very much align with your mission and your vision. But where we step into play is helping you get the data that you need. So an example of this would be like maybe a renewable scholarship, where every year, every semester, your applicants who come back into the system, they have to provide updates to release additional funds. Maybe it's a year from now, you want them to show like where they're currently at in their academic journey. So how do we again, in Reviewer, we collect their main application. You did judging and selection. Most groups will step away at that point. I think where we're trying to go is great. Now we know who your scholarship recipients are. Let's not lose them, right? Let's bring them back and collect more data throughout along their journey. So what does that look like? Just very briefly, this goes back to the power of the profile system in Reviewer. So we got Michael here. Michael is one of my scholarship applicants. And again, you can see here that we have Michael's submission form. We got Michael's file uploads. We got the results. The goal here, though, is that you create these workflows. So 6 months from now, 3 years from now, whatever that looks like, we want Michael to come back and submit to you something. That something, again, aligns with those KPIs for impact reporting. But Michael will just simply click add new, and then he will pick from a list like, what is that deliverable? Is it a 2025 transcript? Is it my quarterly update? Is it if it's a need-based scholarship and you awarded Michael $500, but now he needs another 800 for a computer, he'll pick right from that dropdown what he's submitting for. At its core, we're collecting additional submissions about people who already exist. Why this is incredible is that, again, we have to lower the barrier. We work with an organization that does funding for low-income housing. And so you got these applicants who at the spur of the moment run into financial needs, right? So they come into reviewer, and on a Friday night, they might say, hey, I need additional funding because my air conditioner went out and it's 101 degrees. So they would come in here, they'd fill out the additional funding report, it gets submitted, and then by Monday or Tuesday, funds are in their bank account, right? So powerful, powerful stuff. The goal here, though, is they pick the type of form they want to fill out, and then right in reviewer, they fill it out, right? So this is like your additional funds, your impact reports. And then as soon as this gets submitted, it shows up as a line item on Michael's main profile. So you and your team can just simply click into it, and then you can view the content that Michael submitted. I'm going to lump together is both transparency and then just at a high level data security and privacy because it's extremely important. So it goes back to our roots, right? We built Reviewer for two reasons. One, we felt programs were very unfair, very inefficient, but also we wanted to offer insights into why we chose individuals the way we did in hopes that those that didn't get selected have some type of self-development. So a common thing that we're seeing nowadays is full transparency, and this is a super polarizing conversation. But we actually see clients of ours take the score sheets and then allow applicants to come back into reviewer and physically view how they were selected. I'm talking the entire score sheet on a per question basis, score, comment, score, comment. They can physically see how they were evaluated. That's one extreme. The other kind of extreme to that is they might just say, hey, here's general comments that the judges left for you. You anonymize it, but they come into the system and they can see those comments. Another reason why I like this is it goes back to compliance. It's called a proof of process. So we've also done another webinar on this, but a proof of process, excuse me, is typically broken into 4 pieces. It's a public statement that you have before anybody even begins this process. And it says, look, if you're applying to our scholarship, this is the experience that you're going to have. These are the dates and deadlines. This is the type of submission form that you're going to fill out. Here's your score sheet. If you're selected, here's what we request from you next. And the idea is to set the stage so people come in very prepared, but also we have organizations that we work with that would call us up and say, hey, I have a parent on the phone who doesn't agree with the results. They know that their daughter didn't get a scholarship, but they know somebody else did, and they just don't agree. So the idea behind having a proof of process, and this is such a terribly thing to even have to talk about, is that we can kind of go back and say, look, here's the process we said your daughter was going to go through. Here's proof that we followed the process. It is what it is. It helps build community trust before they even begin your forms, that there's some type of infrastructure in place. It's not just going to be like, we're drawing names out of a hat or we're going to randomly pick our favorites, right? So again, we want to be able to show transparency, but also build up the applicants themselves for self-development. So if you're going to go this route, you have to make it easy. I can assure you that you and your team don't want to have to download and export every single piece of judge feedback and scorecard, compile it, and then mail it or email it out individually to your applicants. In fact, we can't email it out because that's very sensitive data that we don't want transmitted through email communication. So what do? It goes back to your profile concept. So applicants rejoin their profile. You will see that off to the right, I've got some communication tools. So in Reviewer, you can one-to-one communicate with your applicants. The general goal here is that you can log obviously private information such as here's the results, and then it sends the applicant a notification, but it doesn't actually have the contents of it. So when they click on a link, it brings them right back into their profile. That way they can kind of see the secure messaging in one spot. But the general goal here is that they will then jump up to the evaluation section up top, and it shows them, again, this will depend on what you want to share, but it's going to show them a list of all the evaluations that were submitted. So in this example, we've got 6 different scores. We made it anonymous, right? So reviewer 2, 3, 4, 5. The applicant that can then click into it. Maybe you want to just show reviewer 4, but no score. That's also fine. And then it pulls the actual scorecard that was filled out or the components of it. Again, many of our clients do question-based prompts, and so it might be like question, the answer, comments, or overarching comments. But the goal is that the applicants can, in one click, come into the system and then view whatever it is that you want them to see. So now I'm kind of going a bit long here. So I'm just going to kind of end here with the last piece. We'll just kind of leave it on the screen for you to look at. It's data security and privacy. It's not a very sexy conversation. It's one that obviously many operation team members aren't even involved with. It's their IT teams. Just note that these are life-changing opportunities for your applicants, right? It's a funding opportunity for a reason. They have a need. They have to be treated as such. For some of the credit unions that we work with, as a really good example, we've actually found out that it's a deterrent from applicants. If they're not aware of what the data security privacy looks like, they won't apply because they don't feel comfortable giving you their very sensitive information. So we have to make them feel confident. We also want to just say things to make them feel confident. We have to be able to back it up, right? And so you and your team shouldn't get bogged down in the very ever-changing environment of compliance. Things like GDPR, FERPA, California. I mean, there's an acronym for everything. You can't be up to date with it, but my team can, right? We have dedicated staff members who are in charge of that purpose. We're updating our software to meet the needs of the ever-changing standards. With that said, the thing that you really got to keep a look at, it doesn't matter what tool that you're using, that SOC 2 Type 2 certification is kind of what the word is that you're looking for. So it's kind of the industry gold standard for a company that has met the needs of like kind of the highest level of privacy. Again, no matter what tool you look for, if you see that, you're probably good to go.